Marcus Hayes was tired, bone-deep tired. From a lifetime of grinding through obstacles and pushing beyond ceilings he never thought he'd encounter. A man who had dedicated decades to public service, climbing the FBI ladder with relentless determination, balancing the weight of being one of the few black agents at his level, knowing every move he made was scrutinized through lenses tinted with bias, prejudice, and sometimes outright disdain. That evening, as twilight settled over the city, the kind of calm that precedes storms, Marcus was driving home from a long day of meetings and briefings when the flashing red and blue lights appeared behind him, piercing the dusky calm. A broken tail light, a trivial fault in any other circumstance, was all it took for the entire dynamic to shift. He pulled over, windows down, hands visible, ready to cooperate fully, but the two officers who approached his vehicle carried with them assumptions heavier than the night air. Marcus, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, briefcase in the back seat, professional demeanor clear even in his posture, should have been exempt from suspicion. Yet their eyes flickered with mistrust, as if seeing through him into a narrative. They had already decided. A black man on the road at night was a problem, a threat, a suspect. The first officer barked questions sharp and accusatory, tone laced with a subtle contempt that was unmistakable. Marcus answered calmly, identifying himself, explaining the broken taillight and his intention to get it fixed immediately. But the officers seemed disinterested in facts. Instead, they intensified their scrutiny, demanding to see his ID, then questioning where he was headed, why he was driving alone, all the while casting sideways glances that said they didn't believe him, that they were sizing him up for some unseen guilt. Despite Marcus's measured tone and cooperative attitude, the situation escalated. The officers' suspicions became accusations. What should have been a moment of routine policing transformed into an episode of humiliation. One officer, his voice dripping with derision, sneered a racial slur under his breath, loud enough for Marcus to hear but too faint for others. It was a jab that cut deeper than any physical blow could. Marcus's face remained composed, but inside a storm raged, a mix of anger, disbelief, and the exhausting familiarity of prejudice rearing its ugly head. When the officer reached for the cuffs, Marcus's protest was calm but firm. "I'm cooperating, there's no reason for this." But the cuffs clicked shut anyway, cold steel biting into his wrists, a symbol of how quickly his identity was erased and replaced by a stereotype. The other officer smirked, whispering jokes about what kind of criminal Marcus must be, as if his tailored suit and calm presence were ironic disguises. In the back of the patrol car, Marcus sat silently, the hum of the engine and distant, city lights contrasting sharply with the bitter reality he faced. He was not just any man, he was the director of the FBI, a fact known to few and completely invisible to these officers who saw only the color of his skin. Handcuffed and led into the precinct, Marcus knew his silence was his weapon for now. He endured the degrading process of booking, photographs, fingerprinting, interrogations, all carried out with a tone that implied guilt before innocence. The officers' conversations around him echoed with casual bigotry, assumptions about his background, about how he must have resisted arrest or been aggressive. Marcus listened, absorbing the unfairness but calculating his next moves carefully. His mind was a fortress of resolve. He refused to let this moment define him or derail the decades of work he had poured into justice. The sting of humiliation burned fiercely, but he reminded himself that truth and power were on his side, and when the time came, he would reveal himself in a way no one here expected. For now, he bore the weight silently, a man misunderstood by those sworn to uphold the law, a man ready to turn the tables and expose the cracks in a system that too often judged by color, not character. This night was a test, a reminder of the fight still ahead, not just in court, but in the hearts and minds of those who let prejudice cloud their duty. Marcus Hayes was not defeated. He was gathering strength, and soon everything would change. The courtroom was a buzzing hive of tension and expectation, packed with observers whose eyes flickered between the defendant and the prosecutors, the judge and the officers who stood with a quiet smugness that spoke of confidence in their own version of the truth. Marcus Hayes sat silently at the defendant's table, the weight of false accusations pressing down on his shoulders, but his posture remained upright, his face calm and unreadable, as the murmur of whispered conversations filled the air, punctuated by occasional nervous laughter from the officers who had arrested him, certain of their imminent victory, and unaware that the tides of this trial were about to shift dramatically. The judge, an older man with tired eyes and a veneer of impartiality, seemed to breeze through the motions, barely paying attention as the prosecutor methodically laid out the flimsy case against Marcus. Charges of resisting arrest, based on contradictory testimonies from the officers themselves and circumstantial evidence, yet the narrative was skewed, painted with subtle hints designed to undermine Marcus's credibility, playing on implicit biases in the room, as if to say, despite appearances, he was just another suspect caught in a web of supposed defiance. The prosecutor's voice carried a tone that blended professional detachment with an undercurrent of assured triumph, as if the outcome was already decided, ignoring the glaring inconsistencies that should have rendered the case weak. Marcus listened intently, absorbing each word, his mind sharp, formulating his response not as a desperate defendant, but as a man who understood the stakes. This was not merely a legal battle, but a confrontation with a system steeped in prejudice, a chance to expose the underbelly of injustice that too often masked itself in procedural formality. As the prosecutor finished and the courtroom quieted in anticipation of Marcus's turn to speak, a hush fell over the crowd, the tension palpable enough to be cut with a knife. Marcus rose slowly, his movements deliberate, radiating a quiet confidence that commanded attention without a single raised voice. He scanned the room with steady eyes that did not flinch or waver, meeting the gaze of each officer with a calm that unsettled them, the smug looks on their faces starting to fade as a flicker of doubt crept in. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch time itself, Marcus reached inside his jacket, his hand sliding into the inner pocket with unhurried precision, and drew out a sleek, polished badge, immediately recognizable to all as the emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp, a wave of stunned silence sweeping through the seats as the spectators processed the revelation. The officers who had arrested him, the very people who had mocked and humiliated him just days before, stood frozen, their faces draining of color, expressions shifting from arrogance to disbelief, confusion, and finally, a grudging acknowledgement of the power before them. Marcus's voice broke the silence, clear and commanding, as he stated calmly but firmly, "I am Marcus Hayes, Director of the FBI," words that echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap, shattering the preconceived notions and forcing every person in the room to reevaluate the narrative they had accepted so readily. The judge's eyes widened behind his glasses, his hand involuntarily tightening around his gavel, while the prosecutor faltered, caught off guard by the turn of events, struggling to regain control of the courtroom. Marcus continued, laying bare the officer's misconduct during his arrest, the racial prejudice that tainted every interaction, and the grave injustice of charging a man without evidence, but simply because of assumptions about his skin color. His words were measured but powerful, weaving a compelling argument that transcended the narrow confines of legal jargon to speak directly to the heart of fairness and morality. As he detailed the events, highlighting the contradictions in the officer's statements and the absence of any legitimate cause for his detention, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably, skepticism replacing certainty, respect replacing derision. Witnesses who had once appeared indifferent now listened attentively, and even some of the officers exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly aware that their actions were being scrutinized under a spotlight harsher than any they had known. The prosecutor attempted to interrupt, to dismiss Marcus's revelations as irrelevant, but the judge silenced him with a stern look, signaling that this was no ordinary trial and that the truth must be heard. Throughout the ordeal, Marcus remained composed, never raising his voice or resorting to anger, his dignity a stark contrast to the arrogance and carelessness of those who had sought to undermine him. His presence commanded the courtroom like a force of nature, quiet, steady, unstoppable. And in that moment, as he stood revealing not only his identity, but also the deep flaws of a justice system too often clouded by racial bias, Marcus Hayes, transformed from a defendant to a symbol, a living testament to resilience, authority, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The courtroom, once a theatre of mockery, had become a stage for justice reborn, and every person present was compelled to confront their own prejudices and the systemic failures that allowed such injustices to occur. This was more than a trial. It was a reckoning, and Marcus was leading the charge. With the courtroom now engulfed in a profound, almost reverent silence that felt heavy enough to press against the very walls, Marcus Hayes stood slowly yet purposefully, his stature commanding every eye and every ear in the room as he prepared to dismantle the falsehoods that had ensnared him and reveal truths far beyond the shallow judgments that had been passed moments before. The tension was palpable, thick as a storm ready to break, and even the judge, who had been accustomed to routine legal proceedings, now leaned forward with an intensity that betrayed a dawning realization that this case was about to transcend mere courtroom theatrics and become something far more profound. Marcus's voice, calm but unwavering, cut through the silence like a sharpened blade, steady and measured, as he declared his true identity. "I am Marcus Hayes, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The declaration landed like a seismic shockwave rippling through the courtroom, shattering preconceived notions and forcing every individual, judges, prosecutors, officers, and onlookers alike, to recalibrate their perceptions instantaneously. The very foundation of the assumptions that had so casually condemned him was crumbling, and in its place was an undeniable presence of authority, integrity, and power that Marcus embodied effortlessly, a living testament to a career forged in the crucible of justice and perseverance. He did not merely flaunt his rank as a means of intimidation, but wielded it as a beacon of truth and accountability in a space that desperately needed both. As he continued, his words weaving a narrative that was as compelling as it was painful, Marcus exposed the layers of misconduct that had marred his arrest. From the initial racial profiling that tainted the officer's judgment to the deliberate distortion of facts during the booking process and the overt dismissiveness of due process, all underscored by a dangerous complacency towards prejudice that threatened the very principles the law was supposed to uphold. His voice, infused with a righteous clarity, peeled back the veneer of justice to reveal the raw, uncomfortable realities lurking beneath, forcing the courtroom to grapple with a truth that many preferred to ignore, that systemic bias had led to an innocent man's humiliation and near ruin, not because of his actions, but because of his skin color. The judge, a figure who until then had remained an impartial arbiter, now found himself confronting the uncomfortable realization that his courtroom had been complicit in allowing prejudice to masquerade as legal procedure, a moment that brought, with it, a flicker of self-reflection and a visible tightening of his jaw as he struggled to maintain decorum while his conscience wrestled with the magnitude of the injustice laid bare before him. The prosecutor, caught in the wake of Marcus's revelation, faltered, their earlier confidence now replaced by a stammering defensiveness that could not mask the dawning comprehension that the case they had so blithely pursued was built on a foundation of faulty assumptions and unchecked bias. The officers who had once laughed and whispered behind Marcus's back now stood motionless, their faces drained of color, eyes wide with disbelief and perhaps shame as they faced the undeniable fact that they had not just arrested an alleged criminal but a man who held the highest authority in federal law enforcement, a man whose career had been dedicated to rooting out corruption and ensuring justice for all. Marcus's presence alone recalibrated the entire courtroom dynamic, shifting the balance of power and truth in a way that demanded recognition and respect. He proceeded to outline specific instances of misconduct with precise detail: the aggressive and unnecessary use of force, the failure to read his rights properly, the rush to judgment that ignored exculpatory evidence, and most devastatingly, the racial prejudice that had influenced every step of the process. Each accusation was not delivered as an attack, but as a call for accountability, a plea for systemic change that transcended this single case. As Marcus spoke, the courtroom atmosphere transformed. Whispers of doubt spread among the jury, nods of acknowledgement appeared in the gallery, and even the most skeptical began to question the narrative they had been fed. Marcus was not just defending himself, he was challenging an entire system, using his experience and authority to expose flaws that had allowed injustice to thrive unchecked for far too long. His words resonated deeply, touching on the very essence of fairness, dignity, and the promise of equal treatment under the law. The judge, now fully engaged, called for a recess to allow all parties to regroup, recognizing that the trial had shifted from a procedural matter to a profound examination of justice itself. Outside the courtroom, Marcus's revelation ignited conversations and media coverage that would reverberate far beyond the legal walls, sparking debates on racial profiling, police accountability, and the responsibilities of law enforcement to serve and protect impartially. In that moment, Marcus Hayes was no longer merely a defendant fighting a baseless charge. He had become a catalyst for change, a symbol of resilience and integrity who refused to be diminished by prejudice. His decades of service and battles against corruption gave him an unmatched moral authority, and he wielded it with grace and power, ensuring that those who underestimated him learned a lesson they would not soon forget. What began as a personal humiliation transformed into a collective reckoning, shining a light on the dark corners of a justice system in desperate need of reform. Marcus's revelation was a turning point, not just in his life, but in the lives of all who witnessed it, and a testament to the enduring power of truth, courage, and unyielding resolve in the face of injustice. News of the courtroom revelation and the humiliating arrest of Marcus Hayes, the FBI director, spread like wildfire through media outlets, social networks, and conversations across communities, igniting a nationwide discourse about racial injustice, law enforcement accountability, and the deeply entrenched biases that continue to permeate institutions meant to uphold justice. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Citizens, activists, and officials demanded answers, calling for thorough investigations into the officer's conduct and the practices that allowed such a miscarriage of justice to unfold, especially against a man whose career was dedicated to dismantling corruption and protecting the innocent. Under the glaring spotlight of scrutiny, the police department could no longer shield the officers involved behind a wall of silence or procedural jargon, and disciplinary actions were swiftly initiated. Internal Affairs launched comprehensive inquiries, placing the officers on suspension and recommending retraining and, in some cases, termination, signaling a hard reckoning with the culture of prejudice that had long been tolerated. Marcus, despite the personal humiliation and violation of trust he endured, refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he transformed the painful experience into a powerful catalyst for change, channeling his energy into spearheading initiatives within the FBI and beyond that, aimed at eradicating racial bias, improving transparency, and rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. These initiatives included comprehensive bias training programs, the implementation of more rigorous oversight mechanisms, and the creation of community liaison offices designed to foster dialogue, understanding, and cooperation, all grounded in the firm belief that justice must be impartial and respect the dignity of every citizen, regardless of race, background, or status. Marcus also engaged directly with policymakers and advocacy groups, pushing for legislative reforms that would hold law enforcement accountable and ensure that no one, regardless of their identity or position, would face the kind of humiliation and injustice he had suffered. As he worked tirelessly behind the scenes and in the public eye, Marcus's story became emblematic of resilience and strength, a beacon of hope and a clarion call to confront and dismantle prejudice wherever it lurked. Interviews, speeches, and forums featuring Marcus resonated widely, inspiring individuals and institutions alike to question their own biases and commit to the difficult work of change. Through it all, Marcus maintained a humble yet resolute demeanor, embodying the principle that courage coupled with truth has the power to transform not only individual lives, but entire systems. His journey from defendant to defender of justice underscored a profound truth, that the fight against discrimination and injustice is ongoing, requiring vigilance, leadership, and an unwavering commitment to equality. In reclaiming his name and dignity, Marcus Hayes did more than just clear his own record. He fundamentally altered the culture within the FBI and sent a message to the nation that no one is above the law, but that the law must be applied fairly and without prejudice. His legacy became a blueprint for how power can be used responsibly and justly to create a more equitable society, proving that even in the face of deep-rooted systemic flaws, change is possible when individuals stand firm, speak out, and refuse to accept anything less than true justice. And so, as the dust settled from the storm his revelation had unleashed, Marcus Hayes continued his mission undeterred, a living testament to the enduring power of resilience, integrity, and the unyielding pursuit of a justice system that honors the dignity and rights of every person it serves.